it's like 2 point or 3.0. Why is it skipping my mind?
TurboLink.
TurboLinks, yeah, TurboLinks looks. I mean that. So you're incorporating like what is that? Web services, not web services, but web sockets.
Yeah.
All that seems pretty darn cool. I guess that was more like cable, active cable or something like that. But
Yeah. That
yeah,
there's action cable.
Action cable. You're right.
Yeah.
Action cable. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I just watched it a couple hours ago. But yeah, I'm not really too crazy about WebSockets. It might be better because they have something similar in Rails 4. I think it's 4.2 and beyond, where you could do some sort of like pseudo WebSocket thing.
Okay.
Which I don't think they really got it right with that. It wasn't. I looked at it for a Hack Day project for my last job, and it wasn't up to speed to what I needed it to do to make a chat app, basically. So I guess they're reworking that, and now it's going to be whatever action cable or whatnot. So, but I'm just after my impression of trying to do it in Rails first, and now switching to Node to do my WebSockets. I find that I'm kind of stuck in the Node path, so I don't see why I would switch unless it was like amazing. Which I mean, I could when Rails 5 comes out, I could be basically like awed and switch over when I see it. But yeah, I'm kind of like not too excited about that, but I'm excited about the API stuff for sure.
Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Cool. Yeah, like I said, just want to go over chapters 8 and 9 real quick, and then I also want to talk about like. So I did start a project. I flew over to Florida for my wife's birthday over the weekend, and on the flight back, I started a project that I had an idea for, a project on top of all the other projects I have, and I quickly threw together an API with test. I've got passing tests and everything, and I did that like on the plane flight from Tampa to Dallas. I had a connecting flight to Dallas, and I was able to throw that together real quickly. So I think I want to go, rather than go over the code we've already been working on, we'll probably do that in another session in the future. I just want to show the code that I went through, and I guess the next steps of what I'm trying to do, and kind of incorporate what we're going to talk about now. But yeah, so I'll just jump right in chapter 8 with composition. So composition, it's basically the difference. It can be compared to inheritances, and I kept hinting at it every time I was talking about something to do with inheritances, kind of thinking too far ahead in the future in the book. But I've always had a tough time kind of understanding composition and knowing when to use it. And even when this project I just explained, I probably spent about 30 minutes like literally writing down on paper which way would be better, and kind of like mapping it with like not a Venn diagram, but with the trees, and trying to figure out, should I do this composition or should I do this inheritance? And I ended up going with, actually I haven't gone with inheritances. I haven't got that far yet. So I am going to go with inheritances though. That's what I'm kind of leaning towards. But maybe you might have a comment or you might push me in the other directions once I show you. But yeah, composition is basically, so with inheritances, I guess I'll paraphrase from the book. Inheritances it inherits from its parent class. So all the stuff that's happening in the parent. So if you set up, the example that she keeps bringing up is the spare parts. If you set up spare parts in your bicycle class, and then you create a mountain bike that inherits from bicycle, it inherits all the spare parts. So what the deal is with that, you'll have to decide if you either want to discard or discount anything that comes from that inherited spare part method or object, or not. Yeah, we'll just go with method or attributes. You can either discount those, or you can incorporate those and then add your own attributes that are from mountain bike classes. So it can get kind of hairy, especially if you do like the polymorphic inheriting upon inheriting. So you have like you've got children who are actually parents, and then it starts getting a little crazy as you start building up the tree even further. And I think she doesn't have an example, so this is composition. But the difference with this is, rather than doing spare parts and inheriting that, you'll still keep bicycle as a separate class, but you have rather than inheriting the mountain bike, you're starting to create more of these different components outside of that that will then create a mountain bike on top of the bicycle class. So here she's got like the bicycle with the standard stuff. She's got her spare parts. And then now she has a parts class, which I don't think she hints at. No, she has a parts class, which then creates basically it creates the parts in its own separate class, which then you have like spares and all that other stuff. So now parts is now inheriting road bike parts. So the difference being now you have an attribute called tape color, and this is what I was explaining before. There's no tape color in the regular parts, but with road bikes, I guess that matters. And I guess I should know this. I have a road bike, and so there's so the difference being that everything that happens in parts, road bikes has access to, and then some, which is all this stuff down here. And it also sets, it overrides the default size for the tire to 23. Which I think, let me scroll by it too far. Okay, so it doesn't override because there's no, there it is. Default size, it's going to raise a non-implemented error. So you're going to get an error if you don't set a default size for your tire. So it's basically just doing that. So you could choose not to put that in there and you'll get an error, or you can choose to actually set your default tire size. So that's inheritances, and then here is the tree that I was talking about, and how it's inheriting from that, but mountain bikes and road bikes have their separate thing. And then where are we at? So now composing. So we have a bicycle and we have parts, and a bicycle knows nothing about parts, but a bicycle gets spares. I guess spares carries over the parts. And so inside parts, it's not inheriting, but there are parts inside of parts, if that makes sense. And this, I guess there's a flag that tells if that part needs a spare, if it's like a true or false Boolean. Does that make sense? Am I kind of rambling?
Yep, making sense.
Yeah, so then she goes over the I guess what the above was doing. So she's got her bicycle and her spares, and then she's got her parts, which have singular parts in it inside the spares. And sorry, let me close my mail so I stop getting notifications. And yeah, and then we have our parts. So parts don't really know anything about parts plural, but parts plural is knows about singular parts because they're actually using parts. And that when you initialize the parts as a plural, you'll then you'll pass in your parts, I guess, in an array, or actually a hash. So it's like so yeah, this is the working code right here. So part.new chain. So you got road tire, tape, and where's it? Oh, so here you got parts, which are now it's created. It creates an array which has access to. So when it creates an array, so that way bicycle now has parts, which then will pass in parts.new. So so everything's like completely separate, which makes sense. And I'll come back to that, just like how everything's separate, because this is where I was stuck on. Whether I should keep everything separate, which now I'm kind of leaning towards composition for my thing. And yeah. So now parts, perhaps it's inheriting from an array, which is like a plain Ruby object. I guess. Actually, I don't remember why she did this. When parts of classes inherit all arrays behavior. The method's like plus. So parts is basically, you're now going to assume that parts is always going to be an array. So now you can do things like, you could do select, because rather than doing like self.select, you can now just do parts.select, because parts is always going to be the right now. So that's cool. I don't think I've ever done that before, but that's actually a good idea. Yeah, so I mean, in a nutshell, it's basically separating things so that way it's definitely reusable code. One of the things she actually comes, this is more of this, so she's got her road bike config, which are parts, and her mountain bike config, which she can just, rather than doing inheritances, she can now have a parts factory, which is a module, which she'll later include in her bike class. Yeah, and so that way she can just have the array of parts and then start building. If it's a mountain bike or a road bike, she starts building a bike right then and there, rather than just inheriting a bunch of stuff that's not really needed to be inherited and stacking different classes on top of classes with parents and children, which is, you know, it's a different way. So it makes it easier for testing. So if you wanted to test something specific for like a mountain bike, you have that ability to do that without having to worry about anything that might be inherited from the regular bicycle class. If you wanted to test specifically bikes, and you definitely don't need to know about like if it's a road bike or if it's a mountain bike, you just wanted to test something specific about bikes, you're able to do that too. So it's a separation of concerns, which makes it easier to add new bikes. One of the stories actually I brought up when we first started doing these meetings. At my previous employer, we did a lot of social media integration. So my example that I brought up was the Twitter. I had to have either a Twitter to post photos to Twitter or to do regular status updates. So my solution was to create an inheritance from the regular Twitter class to have different attributes. So the way status updates worked, it had everything that Twitter had. So the way it talked to the actual Twitter REST API, it was all inherited. But to actually create the Twitter status update was different than the way you created a Twitter photo update. And it turned out to be quite a mess, which in hindsight, if I knew enough about composition, it would have been a great opportunity to refactor in the composition, because it would have made sense to have a separate, like a post or a status, not a status update, maybe like an update status method that could be interchangeable with photos and regular status updates. Well, okay, now that's not really good naming. Anyway, whatever the name would have been, it would have made more sense to just have a method to abstract those two different functionalities rather than create entirely new inheritances off of the Twitter main class. So yeah, and then also on top of that, testing was rather hard, especially integration testing. We were full stack Rails, so front to back integration was a little tougher because you had to do Twitter photo updating and Twitter status updating quite differently. But then the other problem with so I'll get to towards the end of this chapter. One problem that she mentions with this solution is that you can find yourself building out too many small parts that are doing very small things, which is the opposite of what most Rails apps are probably see. Most Rails apps probably have one class that does too many things, but you could also have the opposite, which is composition. We have tons of different classes and modules, and it's very hard to follow where stuff's coming from. You're including different modules, concerns, services, in order to create this a very clean abstraction. And I guess that could be that same benefit could be the downfall to an app also. So that's his whole last this cost of inheritance. She mentions the inheritance, which I've already went over so many different times, even while I was talking. And then there's the cost of composition, which is what I just mentioned. There's like a structural independence, basically, between the different modules, that it makes it hard to backtrace different bugs, which is kind of like a segue into the next section, which is testing. So did you have anything to add, Jeff, about composition? Or do you use composition? Have you ever?
I wish I could say I had more experience with composition. No, I've actually never used it in a project. So what you've said makes sense to me. But it's just without writing any code. Sometimes it's like you can understand it, but I've never actually used it in code.
And what makes it easier? So what I found as I got more experience as a Rails dev, I started using composition more and not realizing, because a lot of times, like now when I start a greenfield app, I just think that I make the decision up front. But when you already have inheritances, a good way to kind of move towards composition in certain things is things like in Rails, you've got services and you've got concerns and those type of things, that some code that might not necessarily need to be in a class. So for example, um, so we had this with Isaiah, we had different, not just Twitter, we had Instagram, we had Facebook integrations, but each one of those integrations all had a publish method. So since every integration had a publish method, we were able to abstract into a concern, a publishable concern, which once you include that publishable concern, you have the publish method available within that class. And so everything that had to do with publishing, anything to do with collecting like specific methods and preparing a publishable method. So like not everything publishes the same way, but you could abstract in the publishable module the different functionality that needs to be included into the publishable method, if that makes sense. It's kind of hard not, I guess it's easier, I guess, to show the code.
Yep.
But yeah, just like especially, so Sandimat's rules, if your class becomes like over 100 lines, I think is the number, then it's probably it might be time to start abstracting certain things out of that class. And those things that you abstract out of that class, that doesn't necessarily need to be a class, or maybe you see that you're using that same method, like the publish method or whatever method, in different classes in the same way. Those certain things can be abstracted into a concern or a separate module, which will move you towards composition and less reliant. You'll be less reliant on inheritances, if that makes sense.
Yeah. In fact, Brian, this makes me wonder, on a recent project, actually like on a current project that I'm working on, we basically are doing some data mining, and we're using a number of different APIs to hit, we're using several APIs to basically, gather information for this one kind of object, right? Kind of this. Anyway, what I did was, each of these APIs, they have their own client wrapper, API wrapper. But then what I did was basically I wrote an adapter that basically abstracts all of those Ruby wrapper, or all of those API wrappers into one interface.
Yeah.
I think this is an adapter. And so I don't know if you'd consider this a form of composition or not, but
no, yeah, it would be.
Okay.
Having an adapter is definitely for sure composition, because you're abstracting that code, that reusable code, with separate concern or module, whatever you want to call them. They could basically be called anything. I had so I went to a Rails meetup last week, and a guy was talking about this very same thing, this whole book, basically, and how he kind of implements refactoring a project. It was actually at the company Teespring, which they do like T-shirts and like kind of like Kickstarter.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. I've got a few of their T-shirts actually.
Yeah, so they had started off as like a PHP shop and then switched over to Rails very early on, and then they inherited a lot of like bad Rails code as people were learning how to do Rails and stuff like that. So it just became a big headache trying to add new things and do different things in their code base. So he started abstracting things into like services and concerns, and he talked about how he did that process. I don't think he posted his slides. I got to ping him on that, because it was actually a very interesting talk. He didn't actually get through the entire thing, but being able to abstract stuff like that, it's like, even if there are just adapters, everything talks to an API, and there might be a lot of them might be very similar, and to be able to do that makes a lot of sense. Especially if it makes it a lot easier, like when you test. I guess we'll get into that shortly, but when you test, you want to be able to abstract like API calls, even like REST calls. So to be able to mock that properly, in a test. So if you had that adapter test, if you went down that route, you could just it's not you don't want to definitely don't want to hit the API every time you run your test. So you do a thing called stubbing or mocking rather.
Yeah, I just been using VCR.
Yeah, that's something I need to get into. I used it for my last job, but I haven't used it for any project outside of that. But yeah, doing things like that so that way you don't have to hit the API every single time, and it gets especially Twitter. Actually, you have so many times you can hit it within like I think like 30 minutes or an hour or whatever, and then you get locked out. And so you definitely don't want to run your tests and have that use your allotted time or whatever or request. But let me jump into some of this testing stuff. A lot of what she's talking about in testing, which I don't know. I feel like Sandy Metz definitely leans on the side of composition over inheritances. But I think she purposely built you up into inheriting for the simple fact that most people use inheritances over compositions, like without even thinking. So I think like when I read the book the very first time, I was like, oh man, this all makes sense. This is great. I get this. I get inheriting. I get why you should do it and how the benefits. And then when I read chapter 8 the first time, I was like, oh wow, she like built you up basically to kind of shoot you down and tell you you've been doing it wrong, but like in like a nice way. But yeah, so with testing, she talks about like basically this entire the chapter is called Designing Cost Effective Test, and she talks about testing with intention. So basically like intentional testing. So I found when I first started testing in learning how to test, like even doing TDD, like I felt like I was just writing like not like the dumbest test, but basically like the dumbest test. Like I would write like the same test over and over again. Like I'd write, set up my objects and then make sure like I'd pass in a name and then make sure that name was actually returned, which in hindsight, like, I guess, let me pull up the project too while I'm at this. I probably should have prepared, but yeah, in hindsight, sorry, I got everything nested really deep. There we go. So it'd be easier to kind of pull up a test to kind of explain.
Yeah, I found. Let's see. I hope I'm saying this right. It's been a while, but I found that these concepts really help me in trying to decide what to test, right? Because she talks about there's two different kinds of messages, right? There was the query and then there was the command, and you would never test a query, but you would test a command, because a command is something that would basically go out and do something and bring something, or go out, do something, and then like basically, yeah, return something. And so that's when you'd stub that out. But then the query wouldn't, you wouldn't test that, because that would actually be tested when you're testing the interface of the object that's actually getting that message.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. Yeah,
that makes sense too. But yeah, just like tests that cost a lot to write. So like I'm creating, so this is what I see a lot, is you'll create a movie and you'll pass in the name Twister, and then you'll create a test, expect that movie, that name is Twister, which is a great example of how testing works, but not a great example of like actually writing good tests. Because if you're passing in Twister, you don't want to test to make sure you're getting Twister back. That would be silly. But rather you would test that maybe that movies that count like is not one. It's not proper syntax, but is not 0. Something like that. Then now you're actually testing that you would have making sure it's movies. But yeah, now you're testing that actually you created a movie. Not that you actually created a movie and then that the movie that you created that you literally just passed in the name to, that you're getting the name back. Like you would do something like that, which still this could also be argued as not a good test. But sometimes like when you're doing TD, like when I find I do a TDD, I'll write this test, but then as I write more tests and more specific tests, like this is a good one, like expect movies that stars to include Julia, which might fall into maybe not testing a query. But I actually do this test a lot, just if I have a movie that stars include Julia, just to make sure that stuff like the belongs to relationship actually works and like that. But like once I start getting the more specific tests like that I'm seeing here, then I'll go back and I'll delete this test. That test is no longer needed. Like it helped for the process of getting in there, but what I find that I don't do a very good job of is deleting tests, because for the most part, like if we go into movies, that's right, I'm not in bacon rating. Yep. If we go into movies and like I had extra code, like I'd have no problem deleting code that I wasn't using, but for test, like even though the test is actually not, like sometimes I'm not even like using a test, I don't always delete a test, and that could be like the difference of like 5 seconds or 0.05 seconds. That could be very valuable in writing your entire test suite. But yeah, that's going on a bit of a tangent, but that was more of like intentional testing, knowing what you're testing and why you like what's the goal of why you're testing. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I've personally battled with, like myself, trying to figure out like, why am I testing this? Or I created a test. I find like debugging. If I'm debugging for something, I'll write a test specifically for one thing, just to test to see if something works. And I don't always go back and delete the test that I don't need while I was trying to explore into a bug. So, yep. So here you go. Knowing your intentions. Why are you writing a test? Are you trying to find bugs? Trying to prevent bugs? Sometimes texting allow you to defer design decisions. As your skills improve, as your skills improve, you'll start writing better designed apps. Because a lot of times, like I'm building this API, which I'll get into in a sec. I'm building an API right now, and for a project that I think might be a pretty nice project that I'm probably going to be working on for a good while. And since I did the design as we were working through this IMDb thing that we haven't finished yet, I was able to think through some things with you guys that made it very easy for me to think through, like testing wise, while I was on the airplane trying to figure that out. So testing helps build that sort of like architecture, code architecture muscle. And it also, so here's another thing. So with composition, it supports abstractions. So if you're abstracting a parts factory class to build parts for a bicycle, you can test that specific functionality. And you don't have to have like a huge bicycle class test suite with like 150 lines. You can actually just have a parts factory test suite or test file that specifically tests how the parts are made and how the parts go together, rather than throwing that into a bicycle class, which a bicycle class doesn't need. A bicycle class would probably test more of like how a bicycle interacts with the preparers and with the riders and all that other stuff. So you don't have to, you get a faster test suite, especially if you're, like what I do a lot of is testing while I'm working on certain things or including certain things, I'll run certain test files to make sure certain things work. So rather than writing an entire test file unnecessarily, I can just run, that specific thing I'm working on. I just talk circles around that. Hopefully that made sense. Yeah. So, and then this is what you were talking about, like testing the messages. Is that what you're talking about?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So like every object sends and receives messages, and you definitely want to test. You want to test those objects. You want to test the messages that they receive and send, which is a great point that you brought up, which I'm glad you did, because then I'll be able to spend more time on this. But yeah, this was something that I did not completely understand before when I was trying to test, because I think I read this book probably around 6 months after I finished Block, and I think I was already into my actual code job and not really understanding testing. I knew how to test, but I didn't understand like purposes, and this kind of like just opened up a whole new like way of thinking in the testing that helped a lot, for sure. So yeah, definitely think about like it's a lot easier to think about the messages that are sent and received. And that's another thing is like she mentions this towards like the complete end of the book, about private messages and private methods rather.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes like there's certain things that we do to like make things work, that like if we go to abstract something out of a large method, maybe your method's 10 lines and you're running a loop, and your loop doesn't need to your loop doesn't necessarily need to be in that method, and you can abstract that in there. Sometimes I'll just abstract that loop into a private method and pass in the attributes that are needed, and I'll put that in a private method because you could spend a lot of time trying to test things that probably should be a private method. And usually, like if I don't know if this is not a rule from the book, but usually if I'm spending a lot of time, because I guess the rule of thumb is if you have a method in your class, you should test it, and if it's a private method, you shouldn't test it. And usually, if I get to a point where I'm trying to test to prove a functionality of a method that I created or an addition to a class, and it's hard to, for one, it's hard to set up the test because of like certain dependencies. She mentions in this actual chapter, I don't know exactly where, but that's a good code smell to let you know that you have too many dependencies in your class, and it might be time to start refactoring into its own what do you call it? Into start to do composition or into a module or whatnot. So that's one code smell. Another one, if it's too complicated, probably should be best fit into a private method until because a lot of the things like one of the things I like to do on exorcism a lot is to abstract complicated algorithms or math into a complicated algorithm math method. So like I had the pleasure of going to a meetup on a regular basis with a guy who was a mathematician. Like he literally went to school for math, and he decided like later on that he wanted to learn how to code. So he was going to this Ruby meetup, and I got to know him. So like his concept and like how like math works, he would do like code katas and like do like very complicated like methods inside his classes, or have like huge methods of doing like complicated math things that could be abstracted into separate methods. So what I would always tell to him, because this is like a Ruby dojo where you like literally you have a problem and you TDD with other people to solve this problem. And so I would always abstract his stuff into a separate method and call it like complicated math. Because like, for example, like prime numbers, like this, the math, if you like sat down and wrote out like, actually there's a Wikipedia article that I think he gave me about prime numbers, how they work, prime number algorithm. Oh no, he had a test that he knew from doing math. Like basically if you like added a number twice and divided by whatever, then you would know if it was prime. And yeah, I think like some sort of like algorithm that he had already known that he threw out there one day in one of our code kata sessions. And I was like, yeah, that's cool that you did that, but that definitely needs to be in its own method called like complicated math, prime factoring or whatever it was. And like things like that, like, you know, it works and you prove that it worked at like once, but if you spend like half a day trying to figure out how to write a test to prove that it works, it might be best suited in a private method. Or what I always got him at was, why don't you just use the prime library in Ruby? But he was
yeah. And what do you say about that?
Yeah, he said anything math wise, he preferred not to, because I guess, you know, massaging his math muscles, I guess.
Okay, sure.
He was just proud of it, which I gave that to him. You know, that was what he brought into the table, so I let him do that. But every time I had to do something, I just included the library. There's no point of rewriting that.
I agree, especially when it comes to prime numbers.
Yeah, but yeah, that was a learning experience for me, and on its own too, just like coding with that guy, because he was like a math
that's
genius.
really cool. That's cool.
But yeah, and then also being able to abstractions kind of rolls right into knowing when to test. like, so I guess a lot of people are, as far as block, since I've been here, I've kind of like really pushed to do test first. I did test first, like TDD where I came from, but not very regularly. And I would always start off with TDD, but then kind of break away from it. But this book definitely says, TDD is not like, it's not a necessity to do. And Sandy Metz is on the impression that TDD is not 100% guaranteed that you're going to write great tests or write great code. I think what it actually does, and what she mentions, is actually it helps you think towards writing good code. And it helps you think of things that you probably would not have thought of if you just started throwing code on the screen. So I'm back and forth on TDD, whether to do it or when to not do it. I know I found it very helpful last week when I was doing a bug. Since I'm still learning the code base, to be able to write a test first, so that way as I start solving the problem and realizing that I solved the problem, and I solved the problem by over architecting it. So I solved it, but then added all this other stuff that wasn't necessary. So when I got the code review, I basically was just told, hey, you don't need to do this. Delete all this code. And I was like, okay. So when I delete all the code and my test still passed, then I knew that basically I didn't need to do all the stuff I did.
Sure, interesting. Yeah.
So that kind of helps, having the test to kind of help prove what you need to do. And then another thing that happened with that same bug that I worked on, I actually solved the problem, but I solved it not the proper way they wanted it to. Basically, I had this filter. I created a scope based on the created at date, but there was actually a different object that was inherited by that created at that object that I was testing on, that they will actually. And so so we have enrollments for block, and with enrollments you have enrollment chains, and the created at date for the enrollment change is actually further back. So it's actually older, and for each enrollment would have a different created at date. So basically my problem was I needed to actually grab the enrollment chain date, not the enrollment date, because the enrollment date could be sooner than the enrollment chain. So knowing that, I was able to just change a couple lines of code and still see that the test passed. So it helped out a lot. So instead of like going in the console, making sure the code runs in the console or compiles, and then change some code and then run it in the console again, rather than do all that, I just had a test, which made it a lot easier.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
so
I know.
Knowing that intention.
Those are definitely habits that it's hard to break sometimes, because I've done that for so long. And if I just would take the time, and I do try to consciously tell myself, okay, listen, Jeff, you've tested this in the Rails console 10 times now. This would be a good opportunity to create a test for it.
Yep.
But old habits die hard.
Yep, that's very true. But luckily, I mean, I guess I'm in the position where I've kind of I've hopped around a little bit, I guess, and not just like job-wise, but project-wise. I've had like my block capstone project that I basically built after I read this book. I built an entire test suite after I read this last chapter. I think after the second time I read the book, and I basically refactored the entire capstone project that I did to make it cleaner and easier to read code.
Oh wow!
And then also I did the Steamrollers project, which I built that API with tests and everything like that. So I had that, and I had a few other projects I did since then that I was able to, like for even Ruby newbies, I built an entire blog app that I never actually released because I realized it was kind of dumb to build your own blog app when there's so many other platforms that will do it better. So I ended up, like, the code's still live on master on GitHub, but I ended up going with using Middleman instead. Or actually, no, I think I took out the entire blog functionality. It's a static page now. But for my personal blog, I went with Middleman instead because you could spend all day like basically upgrading a Rails app that you hand built for your blog and never read a blog post. And that's what I found that happened. So I kind of reverted out of that.
Right.
Yep. And yeah, she mentions also testing messages here. In this little blurb here too. She also had a little blurb too about mini test or RSpec. Yeah, she basically, she's I think she leans towards mini tests, just because it comes with Rails. But yeah, she's not for or against RSpec too. RSpec definitely has a bigger community, but I think a lot of people get hung up on either doing RSpec or mini tests, and then they have like a failure to launch where they just don't use any because they don't know which one to do.
All right.
And which in reality, I mean, even like within the first months of your project, if you decide to switch back to mini tests after you did RSpec, it's not really that hard to switch over. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all still Ruby. So.
Yeah, that's right. I think mini test is probably a little easier. You know, there's not as many capabilities, you know, compared to RSpec, but it's just like you see RSpec everywhere. And so I don't know. I mean, I've gotten advice from a lot of different people. Oh, you should start in mini test. Oh, you should start with RSpec. You know, and the purists are kind of like, oh yeah, use mini test. But I don't know, like if you're looking at a lot of tutorials or blogs or whatever, it seems like most people use RSpec. So, but then Aaron Patterson, you know, he said, well, any good dev will be able to go freely between each. So there you go.
Yeah, which I feel like I'm at that point where, I mean, I don't have a problem. Like this thing I did, so with this project I did, it's RSpec, which I have no issue. At work, I do RSpec.
Mm-hmm.
I think for my Steamrollers project, I have mini test, and the project I just started, I do RSpec. So, I mean, they both work. They both have their hangups, and they both have their shortcuts. But at the moment, since I'm kind of really liking Vim, and RSpec has more the Vim RSpec or the Thoughtbot RSpec Vim plugin.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yep.
For me. I've been using that for sure. Yeah, that was basically the book. I mean, I enjoyed reading the book again, and I've got some other books I want to go through again.
Yeah, you know, I really feel like I could probably read POODR another time and even get more out of it, because I've done it. I guess I've read it twice now. Yeah, twice, and I know if I went through a third time, I could definitely even get more out of it. You know, you just kind of peel back the layer one book at it, or one, you know, you peel back the layer one layer at a time.
Yeah.
Peel back the onion, that is. Yeah, no, it's a great book. So just out of curiosity, what's on the batter up position? What's next for books for you?
So I'm not going to do a Ruby book. My next book is going to be the 7 programming languages in 7 weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's a very introductory, an introductory intro is what I was going to say, but that's redundant. But of like different languages like Clojure, Ruby's one of them. Some other, I think Lisp is another one too. But kind of like give you an idea of like what they're used for, what things you can do with the languages, syntax. Another guy at work, we're gonna go through that book together on a weekly basis and just do the 7 languages and then talk about it. As far as Ruby, I think I want to do a little more advanced book probably. Probably like Clean Ruby was one book I've been eyeing. I know Avi Grimm's got another book. I did Confident Ruby a while ago. I might do that again.
Oh, what'd you think of that?
I just did something I learned out of that book, the fetch method. It's a repeat of a lot of the Ruby Tappa stuff that he does. It's kind of like built into its own book.
Okay.
But yeah, it's something that I learned from that book that I haven't forgot. I just used this today and was able to tell a coworker about it to use that method. But yeah, it's something that it's like this book. I think I need to start revisiting more regularly because it's so rich in content, and there's no way you can read that book once and grasp it all for sure, because it kind of just peels back like a huge layer of onion. But yeah, I highly recommend that for sure.
That's cool. I've actually never heard of Clean Ruby, so I was just looking at it.
It's a newer book. Is it Noel Rappin maybe? No, that's not. He didn't.
Jim Gay.
Jim Gay, yeah. I think he's at Cognitech maybe. I don't know where he's at, but I don't know if it really matters. But yeah, he's relatively unknown as far as me, but someone in passing told me about it, and it looks pretty good. I've heard it's pretty good.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, I just want to like show you real quick what I have so far.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Very similar to what we were trying to do with the IMDb. Basically, so with San Francisco, there's the BART, and I am going to create an app that basically is going to have different events, and based on like the event start time and end time, it's going to give you like notifications basically when you need to get to the BART before it's like super crowded. So like I guess the use case is when I first got here, the Oakland A's is right across the bay. It's a competing baseball team for the San Francisco Giants. So when those teams play together, like the BART's completely packed. If you're trying to go to East Bay or if you're trying to go anywhere else in the Bay Area, like it's standing room only. It's like shoulder to shoulder. It's like unbearable basically. And I basically rode the train on the first game of that series unknowingly. Didn't even know the game was happening or whatever. And so I'm going to try to. So my goal is to create this app to be able to pass off notifications to the site to let you know, like, you know, timing wise, like what station you need to get to, like time to get to that station before you basically need to start thinking of other transportation, or like basically a time of when basically the stations will be clear of baseball fans. And then it's like an event. So it's an event API. So basically there'll be other events that I'll try to incorporate besides just baseball. But baseball is going to be my first event that I'm going to do. And it's all going to be local to San Francisco. It's going to be very specific use case, but it's just an app that I thought of that would probably help me out a lot.
Yeah.
And from the people I talked to, a lot of people are on board using something similar.
Yeah, that's cool. So do you have a way to measure the magnitude of the event? So, you know, for example, there might be small events, or on the other end of the spectrum, you've got these two local baseball teams that play, right? And in that case, the magnitude of the event is going to be much bigger. So, like, in order to clear out all the people, it's going to take longer if it's a big event versus a small event. Are you going to try to measure that at all, or
how? You know, I did. That's actually a great question. I am now, since you mentioned it. But it's not something I thought of. I was going to have some sort of, I think magnitude is a better name, but I thought about doing some sort of rating system, basically, like marathons. If there was like a race happening in the city, not as big of an impact as it would be for a baseball game that includes both sides of the bay, or a baseball game that's like, there's definitely going to be like a magnitude based on the game. So if it's like a series game or a playoff game or a pennant race game, or that has to do with like the pennant, those will obviously be weighted heavier based on the calculations. But I still have to like sit down. I have a friend who used to play in the minor leagues and a diehard baseball fan, definitely more than I am. And so I was going to sit down with him and pick his brain basically on like what's different like triggers I need to look for to start like calculating into my handmade algorithm to make this app actually work.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. You know, I'm sure this is probably not available, but it would be interesting if there was an API available for like passenger count, you know, or passenger capacity, so that you could go back and, you know, look at previous events, and you would. I mean, it's a lot of data mining, right? But it'd be kind of interesting to look at for that. I don't think they would. I don't think that sort of information exists, but who knows?
I think actually I'd probably get it. So I had like a hard time trying to find MLB data. So I had to actually build it myself, which is what I'm doing right now. But actually for public transit information, I know like the city of Orlando openly like exposes that for you. So if you wanted to make an app on your own, like about the bus system or whatever, they make that available. So I wouldn't see why San Francisco, being such a tech hub, wouldn't have that, which I'm looking right now. They have an API right here.
You mean that would give you passenger counts and stuff?
Not passenger count, but like probably train capacity. Because not every train that goes through has the same amount of cars.
Right.
The cars are based on like times of the day, but I'm sure they add more cars based on if there's a game happening or whatnot.
Oh, okay, and just kind of use that as more of a meta thing. Okay.
Yeah, so to be able to like have that information. But yeah, this is gonna be like a work in progress for sure. It's gonna be like a fun little, like I've never done anything like this before by far, like handling so much data on my own. So it's gonna be pretty cool to kind of try it out and seek advice and stuff like that as I work on an actual working app.
Yeah, no, that's cool. That'll be fun, man.
Yeah.
I know when I was out in San Francisco, let's see, it's probably like 3 or 4 years ago. I remember I had just gotten an Apple iPhone, and I was using Google Maps, and it was so awesome because it would tell me, because I'm coming from a small town, right? So
Yeah.
it was really cool. With Google Maps, it would tell you like when the next bus was going to arrive, all that kind of stuff. And I just loved it because I felt like I could just get around the city so easily with that. It was just awesome. So yeah, it's kind of fun. This will be a cool project.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I basically built that like this. Scaffolded out some different models. So far, I just have events, and now I have a baseball game event, or no, a baseball game, or sorry, baseball team. So I'm trying to future proof it so I can add in the Oakland Athletics also in the future.
Okay.
And then also add in other. The 49ers aren't really. I don't even know where their stadium is. If they were going to affect it. Yeah.
Huh. Yeah. I don't know.
I don't want to make it just baseball specific, especially if like something happens and like the MLB data like fails on me one day. I want to be able to have like leverage other things. So,
right.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It looks like the 49ers play all the way in the Valley, which I didn't know that. So, it's like a little project I thought of. I tend to like when I work on a project where I have like a purpose, like the IMDb thing is something I do want to get done.
Yeah.
But it's like something. It was more like a toy, so I didn't really
Right.
get like the motivation for it.
Yeah.
But seeing how like I have a purpose for this and I actually want to use this app,
Yeah. No, I
hear
hear
it so much faster.
that's cool. That's good. That's great. Yeah, I find the same thing.
But yeah, I'm looking forward to getting that situated. So far I've got the baseball teams set up. I've got the event set up, and I've got them set up like composition wise, so they're all separate, so nothing's inheriting. And I think
Okay.
I'm gonna keep it that way, and start building. I'm gonna build a baseball handler, is which the name I thought of, to be able to handle scraping Google Now for baseball data for just specifically the Giants games. But then I'm also going to only be searching for home games. So what I'll do is I'm going to populate in the baseball team object. I'll populate the schedule, and whenever there's a schedule, I'm going to have to create like a worker in the background to work. I haven't even gone to details on that route yet, but whenever there's a baseball game on that day, it'll start checking for data once you pass the start time.
Okay.
Which I don't think that would be a point that actually the CEO of the company, I told him about it because he actually said the idea at lunch, and I was like, "Oh, I'm building an app for that." He's like, "Oh, cool, I'm in it." And I pregame.
Is this Dave?
Not Dave, Clint.
Okay.
He actually mentioned not really the same idea, but similar. But he mentioned also pregame would be another thing to look into because the BART's going to be packed just as much coming into the city as it is leaving. So.
That's cool. Yeah, dude, I've never heard of this Google Now. This is cool.
Yeah, it's I used to have an Android back in the day when it first came out, and they're now starting to make it more public facing within Google, like when you search in Chrome or search on Google.com.
Yeah.
And I'm just gonna scrape that data because I'm sure Google would have less problem scraping search results than if I was scraping MLB.com data.
Sure.
So I imagine that MLB will probably have a problem, but Google probably doesn't care.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, that's awesome. So like, how do you kind of see going forward with this? Are you thinking kind of ending the book club and then spinning off the movie database project as sort of its own thing?
Yeah, I think it'll live better because I think a lot of most people were not coming into the book club because for one, we were so far along, and for two, they just couldn't commit to a book.
Yeah,
I think it helps me like when people are like when I'm like doing live coding or talking through like architecture things like we did in the past. It helps to create that conversation. We have like a good feedback going back and forth.
Yeah.
like even when Farish was a part of the club, like being able to like, since he'd probably be the more newer of the three of us, he was able to ask questions that we didn't think of, so that way we can actually help tailor our responses, or actually this helps us think more of like a beginner and be able to explain things. So that's for the most part, this is my goal for Ruby newbies, even though like I'm technically not newbie. I like the idea of always being newbie and being able to explain to other newbies and help them out and stuff like that.
Yeah, the beginner's mind.
Yeah, for sure. That's something I don't want to like. I want to forget what it was like a year ago when I didn't know anything.
Yeah. So